Welcome to the deep dive. We have a really compelling topic lined up for you today.
We do, and it's one of those things that, at first glance, it might sound a bit dry.
Right, like something you just skim over in a dense textbook.
Exactly.
Because we are exploring a fascinating but surprisingly small data set that we pulled from a Wikipedia article. And the article is titled List of African American United States Senators.
Yeah, and the actual data hidden inside this list, it tells an incredibly complex story about American history.
It really does. It's about political power and, well, the literal architecture of our government.
Because the story embedded in this specific data set, it's anything but a straight line of progress. It's characterized by sudden starts, these agonizing stops,
Like
and then
these long stretches of complete silence.
exactly. And then in the modern era, rapid bursts of change. So looking closely at this relatively short list offers a brilliant lens through which to understand the structural evolution of the United States.
It really is the perfect mission for this deep dive. Because to give you a sense of the sheer scale we are talking about, let's look at the baseline numbers.
The numbers are staggering.
Since the year 1789, more than 2,000 individuals have served in the United States Senate.
2,000.
Over 2,000. And it's often called the world's greatest deliberative body, holding immense power over, treaties, Supreme Court nominations, federal law.
Right.
But out of those 2,000 plus people across more than 2 centuries, exactly 14 have been African American.
14.
Just 14. That is less than 1% of all the senators in American history.
Which is an incredible hook when you really think about it.
It is. So today, we're going to explore the trailblazers who make up that tiny fraction. We'll look at the mechanics of the historical gaps between them and the milestones that define the current political landscape.
And to understand how we arrive at that number of 14, we really first have to establish the early reality of the American political system.
Set the context for us.
Right, so the Senate is the upper house of Congress, representing the legislative branch of the federal government. For the first several decades of the United States, African Americans were systemically locked out of this institution.
Completely locked out.
Completely. During the founding era and well into the 19th century, millions of African Americans were enslaved.
Yeah.
And those who were free were largely consigned to a status of second-class citizenship with virtually no voting power. There was zero federal elective representation.
So the entire legal foundation of the country had to change fundamentally before this list could even begin.
It did. And that fundamental change arrived in the aftermath of the American Civil War, specifically with the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870.
Right.
This amendment explicitly prohibited federal and state governments from denying any citizen the right to vote based on that citizen's race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
Which was a massive shift.
A massive constitutional shift that cracked the door open for the very first chapter of our story.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that brings us to the Reconstruction era, which was a period of profound firsts, but also deep, deep resistance.
Very deep resistance.
So we travel back to the year 1870, almost immediately after that 15th Amendment is passed. Hiram Rhodes, Rebels of Mississippi, makes history as the very first African-American to serve in the United States Senate.
Yes.
But getting him officially seated in the chamber involved this massive political and legal fight.
It was a huge fight. The environment in Washington was highly volatile. And to understand the mechanics of this fight, it helps to remember how senators were chosen at the time.
Right, because it wasn't like today.
Exactly. Today, you and I, we vote directly for our senators on a ballot. But prior to the ratification of the 17th Amendment in 1913, senators were elected by their state legislatures.
Right.
So the Mississippi State Legislature, which had just seen an influx of newly enfranchised black voters electing Republican representatives, chose rebels to fill a Senate seat. And this was a seat that had been left vacant during the Civil War.
Oh, this detail is fascinating. He was tapped to succeed Albert G. Brown. Right.
Yes, a politician who had vacated the seat when Mississippi seceded from the Union.
I mean, the poetic justice there is, a black man taking a seat abandoned by a supporter of the Confederacy, it is hard to overstate how significant that was.
It was incredibly symbolic. But when rebels arrived in Washington to take the oath of office, he hit a wall.
What was the actual argument used by his opponents to try and keep him out?
Yeah.
Because they couldn't just say they didn't want him there.
No, they needed a legal pretext. Several Democratic members of the Senate launched a fierce opposition campaign using a highly technical yet deeply rooted legal argument. They cited the infamous 1857 Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott v. Sanford.
Wow. The Dred Scott decision.
Yes, the Dred Scott ruling had declared that black people, whether enslaved or free, could not be considered American citizens.
Okay.
And the constitutional requirement to be a senator is that you must have been a U.S. citizen for at least 9 years.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. His opponents argued that because of the Dred Scott decision, rebels had only legally been a citizen since the passage of the 1866 Civil Rights Act, or the 14th Amendment in 1868, meaning he fell short of the 9-year rule.
That is wild. They were actively using a pre-Civil War, pro-slavery Supreme Court ruling to block integration in 1870.
They absolutely were.
How did the chamber ultimately resolve that standoff?
It was a complete spectacle. The Senate galleries were packed to capacity with onlookers waiting to see how the chamber would vote. Supporters of rebels, like Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, argued fiercely that the Civil War and the subsequent constitutional amendments had fundamentally nullified the Dred Scott decision.
Nullified the whole underlying logic?
Exactly. And ultimately, the majority of the Senate voted to seat him. Revels took his oath and served for a little over a year.
And that momentum really seemed to be building. Because, well, just a couple of years later, in 1872, another African-American man, P.B.S. Pinchback, was elected to the Senate by the Louisiana State Legislature.
Yes, Pinchback.
But his outcome was entirely different.
It was. Pinchback's situation really demonstrates how fragile these early victories were. His election was aggressively challenged by white Democrats in Louisiana, who contested the legitimacy of the state legislature's vote.
They just refused to accept it.
Right. The dispute over his credentialing dragged on for years in Washington, and ultimately the Senate voted to deny Pinchback his seat. He never officially served.
That is such a harsh reminder to keep in mind. Simply winning the vote at the state level wasn't a guarantee of holding power.
Not at all.
But we do see one more major breakthrough in this early era. In 1875, Blanche Bruce is elected by the Mississippi State Legislature.
That's right.
And he becomes the first African-American senator to serve a full 6-year term. Plus, there's an incredibly profound biographical detail about Bruce.
Yes. Out of all the thousands of people who have ever served in the U.S. Senate, Blanche Bruce remains the only senator in United States history to have been a former slave.
Just think about that. Going from being legally classified as property to serving a full term in the highest legislative body in the country within a single lifetime.
It highlights the accelerated, almost dizzying pace of change during Reconstruction. During his tenure, he advocated for the civil rights of African Americans, Native Americans, Chinese immigrants.
He's a true pioneer.
He was. But unfortunately, the structural forces of the era were working against that momentum. Because after Bruce left office in 1881, the representation simply vanishes.
Yeah, the Great Gap. Mississippi had sent the first 2 black senators to Washington, and then the door just slams shut.
Completely shut.
We enter this massive, decades-long gap. What were the specific political mechanisms that caused black representation to drop to zero for nearly a century?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the systematic dismantling of Reconstruction in the South.
Right.
In 1876, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, and the political tide rapidly turned back toward white supremacy. State by state, Democratic-dominated legislatures began passing new constitutions.
And these were specifically engineered to disenfranchise black voters.
Exactly. They were bypassing the 15th Amendment through technicalities.
These were the mechanisms of the Jim Crow era.
Precisely. Starting heavily with the Mississippi Plan of 1890, states instituted poll taxes requiring people to pay a fee to vote. They implemented notoriously subjective literacy tests, where white registrars could pass or fail anyone at their discretion.
Just entirely arbitrary.
And they used grandfather clauses, which stated you could only vote if your grandfather had the right to vote prior to the Civil War.
Which naturally excluded all descendants of enslaved people.
Exactly. By 1908, every single former Confederate state had adopted similar measures. And remember, because state legislatures were still the bodies choosing U.S. senators, and black citizens were entirely removed from the state voting process.
Black representation in the Senate was structurally impossible in the South.
It was. This total exclusion persisted until the Civil Rights Movement and the enforcement power of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
So with the South completely locked down by these state constitutions, the fight for representation essentially had to shift geographically.
It did.
And that geographic shift brings us to Massachusetts in the late 1960s. I really want you to think about the timeline here. From Blanche Bruce leaving in 1881 until 1967, there is not a single African-American voice in the United States Senate.
A massive gap.
Almost 90 years.
Uh-huh.
Then Edward Brooke, a Republican, arrives in Washington.
Edward Brooke's election is a huge milestone because the rules of the game had fundamentally changed. As we noted earlier, the 17th Amendment was ratified in 1913,
Right.
and that transferred the power to elect senators from state legislatures directly to the voting public. So when Edward Brooke won his election in 1966 and took office in 1967, he became the very first African American elected to the Senate by direct popular vote.
But how was a black Republican able to build a winning coalition in a majority-white state like Massachusetts during the height of the Civil Rights era? That seems so counterintuitive.
Brooke was a uniquely compelling political figure. He had already built a strong statewide profile, serving as the Attorney General of Massachusetts. He gained a reputation for fighting corruption and organized crime.
So he had that law and order appear.
Yes. He positioned himself as a moderate, appealing to both white suburban voters and minority communities. He built a cross-party, cross-racial coalition, which is exactly what a candidate needs to win a statewide popular election.
And he was reelected, right?
He was. He served 2 full terms, proving that an African-American candidate could succeed on a statewide ballot in the modern era.
But even with Brooks' success proving it was possible, the Senate reverted back to having 0 black members for another 14 years after he left office in 1979.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The next major wave of breakthroughs doesn't happen evenly across the country. It centers on one specific geographic anomaly.
Illinois.
Yes, Illinois. And to be even more precise, it centers on Illinois' Class 3 Senate seat.
Now, for those who might not know exactly how the Senate seating works, what is a Class 3 seat?
The United States Constitution divides the 100 Senate seats into 3 classes. This staggered system ensures that only about 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years.
To prevent the entire chamber from turning over in a single election cycle.
Exactly. Every state has 2 senators, and they are always in different classes. In Illinois, their Class 3 seat became this incredible engine for historical milestones starting in the 1990s.
And the first of those milestones belongs to Carol Moseley Braun.
Yes.
When she won her election and entered the Senate in 1993, she shattered a massive glass ceiling. She became the very first African-American woman to ever serve in the United States Senate and also the first African-American Democrat in the chamber.
Her campaign was a grassroots phenomenon. She was an underdog who challenged an incumbent senator in the Democratic primary and won. She was driven by a surge of support from women and minority voters in Chicago and across the state.
She served 1 term, but the legacy of that specific Class 3 seat was just beginning.
It really was.
Because a few years later, in 2004, a relatively unknown state senator named Barack Obama won the election for that exact same Illinois seat.
And we all know where his trajectory led. In 2008, he makes history as the first African-American senator to be elected president of the United States.
And his elevation to the presidency creates a vacancy in the Senate.
Right. And that vacancy creates a unique domino effect. Under Illinois law, the governor has the power to appoint a temporary replacement when a Senate seat becomes vacant, so the governor appointed Roland Burris.
An African-American politician who had previously served as the state's attorney general.
Yes. By taking over Obama's seat, Burris became the first African-American in history to succeed another African-American in the Senate.
It's just an incredible trio holding that one seat: Braun, Obama, and Burris.
The demographics of Illinois, particularly the heavy concentration of black voters in Chicago resulting from the Great Migration, created a political environment where a black candidate could build a formidable statewide base.
Right, but I want you to imagine looking at a map of the United States outlining black representation in the Senate during the entire late 20th century up through about 2010. The map is almost entirely blank.
Just completely empty space for most of the country.
You have an isolated pocket in Massachusetts and an isolated pocket in Illinois. The rest of the country has no representation on this list.
That geographic isolation really drives home how concentrated these political breakthroughs were. It was not a nationwide wave of integration. And when Roland Burris finished his brief appointed term in 2010, the Senate actually went back to having 0 black members for the next 2 years.
Unbelievable. But then we reach 2013. And the dam finally breaks.
It does.
What shifted in the political landscape to allow so many new voices to enter the chamber in such a short window?
What's fascinating here is that the initial surge in 2013 was actually driven by the appointment process rather than the general election cycle.
Whoa, really?
Yes, in South Carolina, Republican Senator Jim DeMint resigned, and Governor Nikki Haley appointed Congressman Tim Scott to fill the vacancy. Then, up in Massachusetts, Senator John Kerry resigned to become Secretary of State, and Governor Deval Patrick appointed Mo Cowan, a Democrat, to fill that seat temporarily. Because both of these appointments happened early in the year, 2013 marked the very first time in United States history that two African Americans served in the Senate simultaneously.
That is a massive turning point. And there's also a notable piece of history regarding Mo Cowan's appointment specifically.
Right.
Governor Deval Patrick was Massachusetts' first black governor.
Right.
That made Cowan the first black senator ever appointed by a black governor.
It's a great detail. Cowan's tenure was brief, serving only until a special election could be held, but the overall momentum was undeniably shifting. Later that same year, in late 2013, Cory Booker, the Democratic mayor of Newark, New Jersey, won a special election to the Senate.
He became the first black senator elected since Obama.
Yes.
And the pace of these milestones accelerates drastically from this point forward. We completely stop seeing those echoing decades-long gaps. In 2017, Kamala Harris arrives in the Senate representing California. She becomes only the second black woman in the chamber's history. But she also brings a new intersectional milestone, becoming the first Indian American senator, as her mother emigrated from India and her father from Jamaica.
And of course, she eventually leaves the Senate in 2021 to become the first female and first African American vice president of the United States.
Exactly. So during this contemporary period, we really start to see things open up.
We do. We see the archetype of who a black senator is and where they can win begin to diversify rapidly.
Breaking those geographic barriers.
Exactly. For decades, the successful path seemed limited to northeastern or midwestern states with strong Democratic strongholds. But you have Tim Scott building a successful conservative coalition in South Carolina. And then in 2021, Raphael Warnock, a Democratic pastor, wins a highly contested election in Georgia.
Warnock becomes the very first black Democrat to represent a former Confederate state in the Senate.
Yes. When you recall the sweeping, systemic disenfranchisement we discussed from the 1890s, Warnock's victory in a deep South state represents a profound historical closure to that era.
A full circle moment. And the representation continues to broaden across demographics as well. In 2023, following the death of Dianne Feinstein, LaFonza Butler was appointed to represent California,
making her the first openly LGBT African-American senator.
Which brings us to the current landscape. As of 2025, we are witnessing a high water mark for representation. There are a record 5 black senators serving at the exact same time.
Looking at the 2025 roster gives you a clear picture of how much the map has expanded. You have Tim Scott in South Carolina, Cory Booker in New Jersey, and Raphael Warnock in Georgia. Joining them are 2 newly elected senators, Lisa Blunt Rochester representing Delaware, and Angela Also Brooks representing Maryland.
And within that 2025 landscape, there are 2 major historic firsts occurring right now. First, with the arrivals of Also Brooks and Blunt Rochester, we are seeing the first instance in American history where 2 black women are serving together in the Senate simultaneously.
A huge milestone.
And second, Tim Scott has reached a major tenure milestone. He is now the longest-serving black senator in U.S. history. Furthermore, his seniority has allowed him to break another barrier, becoming the first black senator to chair a full committee.
Specifically taking the helm of the powerful Senate Banking Committee.
Right.
And that ability to accrue enough seniority to chair a major committee is a crucial indicator of normalized political power.
Because it's not just about getting in the room anymore.
Exactly. It shows that these senators are not just arriving in Washington. They are holding their seats long enough to influence the core machinery of the legislative process.
We have covered a tremendous amount of ground here and touched on various paths to power. Let's break down the actual math of how these 14 individuals reached the Senate.
So of the 14 total African-American senators in U.S. history, 9 of them were popularly elected by the voters of their respective states. 2 of them, Hiram Rhodes Revels and Blanche Bruce, were chosen by state legislatures back in the 1870s before the 17th Amendment changed the election process.
And 3 were appointed.
Right. 3 of them were appointed by state governors to fill unexpected vacancies and were never subsequently elected to those seats. That's Roland Burris in Illinois, Mo Cowan in Massachusetts, and LaFonza Butler in California.
Looking at the modern elections themselves, there is a relatively new phenomenon emerging. We are starting to see more head-to-head races where both major party nominees for a Senate seat are African American.
Yes, the first time that dynamic occurred was in the 2004 Illinois race when Democrat Barack Obama ran against Republican Alan Keyes. And we have seen it happen several times since.
Mostly in the South, interestingly.
Yes, in South Carolina, Tim Scott faced black Democratic challengers in 2014, 2016, and 2022. And in the highly publicized 2022 Georgia race, Democrat Raphael Warnock ran against Republican Herschel Walker.
It's becoming slightly more common.
The fact that both major parties are simultaneously elevating black candidates to the top of the ticket in statewide races indicates a significant maturation of the political landscape.
Yet, despite these recent surges and a normalization of these campaigns, a stark reality remains when you look at the geographic footprint of this list. Out of all 50 states in the Union, only 9 have ever sent a black senator to Washington.
Only 9.
Those states are California, Delaware, Georgia, Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, Mississippi, New Jersey, and South Carolina.
This raises an important question. What does this slow, highly concentrated pace of integration reveal about the fundamental structure of the Senate?
It's a very different game than the House.
Exactly. By design, the Senate represents entire states, whereas the House of Representatives represents smaller, localized congressional districts. It is historically much easier to elect a diverse candidate in a heavily concentrated district.
Right.
To win a Senate seat, a candidate must build a massive statewide coalition that crosses racial, geographic, and often party lines.
Which takes incredible resources and broad appeal.
Yes. The fact that it has taken so long for black candidates to successfully build those coalitions in more than just a handful of states highlights the deeply entrenched political and demographic hurdles that exist on a statewide level. Hurdles which often look very different than the general population of the country as a whole.
So what does this all mean? When you step back and view this 150-year arc, it is a breathtaking narrative of American power. It begins with Hiram Rhodes Revels in 1870, facing down politicians who literally tried to use the Dred Scott decision to deny his citizenship.
Right.
It moves through the agonizing decades of the Jim Crow era where the legislative door was structurally bolted shut. It highlights the isolated, brilliant political maneuvering in Massachusetts and Illinois. And it arrives at 2025 where 5 African-American senators are sitting in the chamber, chairing committees, and driving national policy.
It really is a sweeping history.
It serves as a potent reminder to you that political history is rarely a steady, predictable incline. It is forged through sudden bursts of momentum, long periods of quiet resistance, and the tireless building of new coalitions.
That captures the journey perfectly. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Returning to one of the biggest structural shifts we discussed today.
Okay.
We talked about the 17th Amendment of 1913, which transferred the power of electing senators from state legislatures to the direct popular vote. It was intended to reduce corruption and give power back to the people.
Right.
But consider the current political climate. Given the intense partisan battles, the stark polarization, and the highly debated district mapping we see in modern state legislatures across the country today, what if the 17th Amendment had never been passed?
Oh, wow.
If our state legislatures were still the bodies retreating behind closed doors to handpick our U.S. senators right now, would the number of African-American senators today be higher or would it be lower? I encourage you to ponder how the seemingly mundane, mechanical rules of how we vote fundamentally shape the human face of our government.
That is an incredible alternate history to think about, and it really forces you to look at the machinery of our elections in a completely different light. Thank you for joining us as we explore the rich, complex history of African-American representation in the United States Senate. We hope you gained some surprising insights and a deeper understanding of how this institution has evolved. Until next time, keep diving deep.